It was winter in 1757. Paris looked grand from a distance, gold rooftops, royal carriages, the echo of church bells. But up close it was cold, hungry, and angry. The Palace of Versailles still sparkled, but that sparkle came from candlelight, not happiness. And inside those marble walls, among the servants who worked without being seen, was a man named Robert-François Damiens. He was not important. He had no title, no money, no friends who mattered. He had worked for nobles, priests, judges, always invisible, always replaceable. But inside him lived a mind that never stopped turning. He believed in God, in right and wrong, and in the idea that someone, anyone, had to answer for the pain that France was drowning in. Life had beaten him down, piece by piece. He'd seen the church take from the poor, the nobles live like gods, and the king, Louis XV, the beloved, lose touch with the very people who once loved him. To Damiens, it felt like heaven itself had gone silent. He began to talk to himself, small mutterings at first. About sin, about justice, about punishment. Some called him mad, but maybe he was simply a man who'd seen too much and mattered too little. At that time, France was like a beautiful painting that had started to crack. The rich had everything, the poor had nothing. People whispered that something terrible was coming, though no one knew what. And in that quiet chaos, one forgotten servant decided to make himself heard. Damiens didn't plan a grand rebellion. He had no army, no allies, only his faith and his despair. On a cold January morning, he hid a small penknife under his coat. Not a sword, not a musket, just a tiny blade, the kind used to cut paper. To anyone else, it was nothing. But to him, it was everything. A symbol, a statement, a way to prove that even the lowest man could reach the highest throne. History would later call him a traitor, a fanatic, a madman. But in that moment, he was simply a servant who believed he was doing God's work, one whisper away from changing his life forever. For days, that whisper grew louder in his mind. It followed him through every corridor he cleaned, every mass he attended, every quiet moment before sleep. He began to believe that his suffering had a purpose, that perhaps God had chosen him, not the nobles, not the priests, to awaken a sleeping France. And so, when the king's carriage was set to leave Versailles one cold January evening in 1757, Damiens was there. The royal courtyard was glowing with torches as King Louis XV prepared to step into his carriage outside the Palace of Versailles. Courtiers stood around him, bowing, laughing, pretending to care. And somewhere in that small, polished crowd stood Robert-François Damiens, quiet, trembling, forgotten as always. He looked ordinary. A thin man with tired eyes and rough hands, the kind of face no one remembers after passing by. But beneath his coat, his fingers gripped the handle of the small penknife. His heart pounded like a drum inside his chest. Every breath felt heavier than the last. When the king approached, smiling faintly at his people, Damiens moved forward. No one stopped him. Why would they? He was a servant, invisible, harmless. And then in one quick, desperate motion, he reached out. The blade flashed. A gasp filled the air. The king froze, shocked. The knife had cut him, just a small wound on the chest. The king touched his coat, saw the blood, and turned pale. The crowd erupted in chaos. Guards rushed forward. Damiens didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, as if even he couldn't believe what he'd done. Within seconds, soldiers pinned him to the ground. The blade fell to the cobblestones. The king was safe. The wound was minor, almost nothing. But the meaning of that cut was everything, because in 18th century France, the king was not just a man. He was sacred. To strike him, even to scratch him, was to strike at God himself. They dragged Damiens away in chains, beating him as the crowd screamed for his death. Someone shouted, "Kill the heretic!" Another yelled, "Tear him apart!" But Damiens said little. Some witnesses claimed he murmured prayers. Others said he whispered, "I only meant to warn him." By nightfall, the news spread like wildfire across France. The king had been attacked, by a servant, a nobody, a man touched by madness. Fear and outrage swept through the court. Priests called it blasphemy. Ministers called it treason. And the judges, they called for a punishment that would remind France who ruled it. The blade had barely scratched the king, but it had cut deep into the heart of the monarchy itself. as Damiens was dragged away. Through the snow-covered courtyard, the crowd shouted for his blood. Guards struck him again and again as if the pain could erase what had just happened. The king was safe, yes, but his image was not. For the first time in living memory, divine power had bled. By dawn, the city was trembling with rumors. Some said a gang of assassins planned to kill the royal family. Others swore it was part of a Protestant plot, or a whisper from foreign enemies. The truth didn't matter anymore. Fear had already taken hold, and so in that fear, the machinery of royal justice began to move. In the days after the attack, France held its breath. The king had survived, but the idea of his divinity had been wounded. If a servant could touch the body of the beloved king, then perhaps the king was only flesh after all, and that was a thought too dangerous to leave alive. So the court decided that Robert-François Damiens would not simply die. He would be made an example, a living warning carved into the memory of France. Damiens was taken to the Conciergerie prison in Paris, a dark fortress that had swallowed countless souls before him. Inside its damp walls, torches flickered and footsteps echoed like whispers from the dead. He was locked alone, chained day and night. Guards were ordered not to speak to him. He was watched even as he slept, as if his silence might spread like a disease. The trial that followed was swift, but not simple. France had never faced such a crime before. To harm the king was not treason against a man. It was blasphemy against God's order. The judges debated, priests prayed, and everyone agreed on one thing. This punishment must fit the sin. They wrote it carefully, word by word, as if scripting a play. Each act, each torture, each moment of his death was decided with precision. Not for justice, but for spectacle. Outside the prison, crowds gathered every day just to see the building where he was held. Pamphlets spread wild stories, that he'd been possessed by demons, that he'd confessed to a conspiracy, that the devil himself guided his hand. The truth no longer mattered. Damiens was no longer a man. He was a symbol, a scapegoat on which France could dump all its fears. And yet, in the darkness of his cell, Damiens remained strangely calm. He spoke of forgiveness, of God's mercy, even of the king himself. Some guards said he wept. Others said he laughed quietly to himself. Perhaps he knew that his fate was already sealed. By early March, the judges delivered their verdict. He was to be torn apart by horses in the public square, the ancient punishment reserved for those who dared attack the divine. They said it was justice. But it was really a message. From a trembling throne to a restless nation, the king had been scratched. And now France would bleed. On March 28, 1757, Paris gathered to watch a man be unmade. The morning was cold, gray, and heavy with silence. At the Place de Grève, a wide square near the River Seine, thousands of people pressed together, nobles in carriages, priests clutching crosses, beggars climbing onto barrels just to see. Every window and rooftop was filled. No one wanted to miss what was about to happen. They had come to witness the last execution of its kind, the tearing apart of Robert-François Damiens. The air smelled of smoke and fear. Soldiers lined the streets holding the crowd back. Drums beat slowly like a heartbeat. Then, from the prison gates, they brought him out. Damiens looked pale and broken, his body covered in wounds from earlier tortures meant to make him confess to a conspiracy that never existed. His clothes hung in shreds, his hands shaking, his eyes half closed. But he was still alive, and barely. A priest walked beside him, whispering prayers. Damiens' lips moved, too faint to hear. Some said he begged for forgiveness. Others said he simply murmured, "My God, give me strength." At the center of the square stood the scaffold, not the usual wooden frame, but something far more dreadful. 4 horses waited there, restless and stamping. Each was tied to a corner post. Heavy ropes and chains glinted in the morning light. They placed Damiens in the middle. The executioner, his hands trembling despite years of experience, fastened the ropes to Damiens' arms and legs. The crowd grew silent. Even the birds seemed to stop. Then came the signal. The horses pulled. Once, twice. The ropes went tight. The sound that followed was not human, a mixture of screams, gasps, and the raw noise of a body being torn by force. The executioners had to stop and adjust the ropes again and again. The task was brutal, and even they were horrified. Many in the crowd turned away. Some fainted. Others watched with cold fascination, as if trying to convince themselves that this was justice, not madness. After what felt like hours, the ordeal ended. What remained of Damiens' body was burned, his ashes scattered to the wind. The king had been avenged, but France had seen something it could never forget. That day, they didn't just tear a man apart. They tore open the illusion of divine mercy, and though no one knew it yet, this horror would echo all the way to the Revolution. For hours after the execution, the square at the Place de Grève stayed silent. The crowds who had come hungry for spectacle now stood pale and shaken, as if they had witnessed something forbidden, something that should never have been seen. The smell of smoke lingered. The horses were led away, and beneath the gray sky what remained of Damiens was gathered into a handful of ashes and scattered to the wind. Paris returned to its routine soon enough. Carriages rolled, bells rang, nobles feasted, but the people who had watched that day carried a shadow home with them. They whispered of the screams of the cruelty, of how the king's justice had looked more like vengeance. The story spread from taverns to markets, from Paris to the farthest villages. And slowly those whispers began to take shape, not as pity for Damiens, but as doubt in the righteousness of their rulers. The monarchy believed it had proven its strength. In truth, it had revealed its fear. And when the ashes of Robert-François Damiens drifted into the wind that evening, it seemed like the story had ended. The king still sat upon his throne. The nobles still danced in Versailles. The priests still blessed the crown as if nothing had happened. But something had changed, quietly, deeply, and forever. For the first time, the people of France had seen the divine mask of power slip. They had seen a man, a mere servant, punished not for killing a king, but for daring to touch him. They saw the cruelty, the theater, the fear that ruled from gilded halls. And behind the horror, they recognized something far more dangerous than Damiens' knife, the fragility of their rulers. Word of the execution spread across Europe. Philosophers wrote about it in secret letters. Foreign visitors described it as a ceremony of hell. Even some nobles whispered that the king's justice had looked more like vengeance. The name Damiens became a forbidden word, one that carried the scent of both sin and prophecy. Louis XV wanted the world to see strength that day, but the world had seen desperation. Over the years, the memory of that execution lingered like smoke in the streets of Paris. Every time a tax rose or a child starved, someone would whisper, "Do you remember what they did to Damiens?" And slowly the whispers became voices. The voices became anger. And that anger, decades later, would turn into revolution. When the guillotine first rose above the crowds in 1789, some said it was poetic justice, that the same kingdom which once tore a man apart now stood ready to tear itself apart. History has many villains and many victims, but Damiens stands somewhere in between, not a hero, not a monster, but a mirror. Through him, France saw its own reflection, cruel, holy, frightened, and ready to break. His name faded, his ashes scattered, but the echo of that day remained. An echo that whispered through the corridors of Versailles, and one day would bring the palace down. Robert-François Damiens, the last man torn apart by horses in France, did not die in vain, for his death marked not just the end of a life, but the beginning of the end of a kingdom.